Morning everyone. We were group 1 and we were tasked to report today about the foreign policy and diplomacy. The first slide, we can see the definition of foreign policy. And in addition, foreign policy is a self-interest strategies of a state to safeguard its national interest. And also, foreign policy changed the scope of intent of a state, which can be affected by the factors of the change in national interest. Foreign policy is influenced by domestic consideration of policies or behavior of other states or plans to advance a specific geopolitical design. So what is the role of state in foreign policy and diplomacy? State embraces foreign policy to enlarge their national interests, and also state uses a strategy of adapting foreign policy to protect and empowers their national interest. So in the third slide, national interest is defined, and in addition to that definition, national interest is a set of values, orientation, and objectives that countries want to possess to achieve their international relations. According to the book of Giovanni Botero entitled The Reason State, national interests defined as the rationality of governing to a state goals, ambitions, and emergence of state-to-state relations.
Hi ma'am, hi classmate. Continuation of our report. My name is Sam. Now we head up onto types of criteria. We have ideological criteria. In this type of criteria, a governor or a leader of a state employ their own ideas to gain national interest. In other words, it can also allow them to know their ally country or their enemies. For example, during the Cold War, the Russians are being known as the communism. Those other countries or states which share the same ideas with Russia form allied with them, which are known as the USSR during the Cold War. While United States, on the other hand, we know them as the capitalism. Other states would also share the same ideas or ideological criteria with United States form allied to help them during the Cold War. Next, we have the moral and legal. First, what is moral? We can say moral is being honest. So when you talk about legal is just like, let's say, obeying and complying or abiding by the rules of international laws. So how about other states who doesn't have international laws? They are being governed or they follow the rules through the spirit of equity and justice. Next, we have the pragmatic criteria. This is a type of criteria which a state is being practical. This is a type of practical governance rather than the theoretical aspect ones. They are being practical in order to gain their national interest. So next, we have the professionalism or the professional advancement criteria. In this type of criteria, the focus is on the growth of the state. Our leader, in other hand, might give more consideration to scholars' idea or opinion rather than the less privileged peoples. So we have partisan criteria. In this type of criteria, it's characterized on the organization of the state more than the national interest. The safety, or let's say the goals of the state more than the national interest. Lastly, we have the foreign dependency. This applies a lot to much African countries and some Asia parts. Why? Because the less privileged or the less developed states depend solely for survival on their ex-colonists. For example, we have Nigeria and some other parts of Africans. They still look up to Great Britain for support. either for defense against war, also for let's say aid, and so on and so forth. So we have foreign policy also involves specific instruments and tactics that they employ in order to realize their goals. We have diplomatic bargaining, we have economic instrument, we have propaganda, we have terrorism, which is also known as sabotage, we have the use of force, which we also know as war. We are going to be touching, or we are now going to be analyzing one and each of these specific instruments used by foreign policy in order to achieve their goals later on the later part of our report. Thanks. Now, foreign policy. Many scholars have tried to define what is foreign policy. You have a lot of definition for foreign policy, but I would love to go with Maria's definition of foreign policy, which says foreign policy can be defined as the set of objectives and instruments that a state adopts to guide its relationship with the outside world. What does this mean? It can be like a goal laid down by a state, and also the various priorities, or let's say perceptions they establish. This is actually being established by a leader of a state to serve as guidelines for choosing various courses of actions in a specific situation in international affairs, in dealing with other countries.
So, in order to realize those objectives and goals, foreign policy also involves the use of specific instruments and tactics. Number 1, diplomatic bargaining. 2, economic instruments. 3, propaganda. 4, terrorism or sabotage. And 5, war or use of force. So the first instrument of foreign policy is called diplomacy. Diplomacy is defined as the process between actors or diplomats who usually represent a state. They exist within a system and engage in private and public dialogue to pursue their objectives in a peaceful manner. So diplomacy fulfills foreign policy objectives by means of mutual negotiation and discussion. It is instrumental in reducing means of disagreement and misunderstanding with other nations. So diplomacy can only be successful if all parties involved are willing to compromise. There has to be mutual trust, clear communication, and a willingness to work together to achieve the same goals. So here are some basic rules that diplomats have used over the years and were proven to be effective. Number 1, be realistic. It is important for a diplomat to know whether his goals are attainable. Number 2, be careful about what you say. An experienced diplomat plans out and weighs their words carefully. Number 3, seek common ground. It is important to maintain a degree of flexibility since most negotiations will involve some concessions. Number 4, understanding the other side. There are several aspects to understanding the other side. One is to appreciate the opponent's perspectives even if you do not agree with it. Number 6, be patient. If you are overly anxious, it can lead to concessions and may convey your weakness to the opponent. Lastly, leave avenues of retreat open. It is axiomatic that even a rat will be trapped into the corner. The same is often true for countries. Call it honor, saving face, or prestige. It is important to leave yourself and your opponent an out.
Specific techniques that can be used to reward or punish constitute by rules control over the flows of goods between countries includes. This is the topics that can use to be changed or making good the flows of the country. So, we have a tariff. What is tariff? Tariff is tax imported by one country on the goods and services imported from another country. Okay? Number 2 is quota. What is quota? It's a fixed shares of something that a person or group is entitled to receive or is bound to contribute. Okay? Number 3 is boycott. What is the boycott? 3 boycott. Withdraw from commercial or social relation between a country, organization, or a person as a punishment or protest. Number 4 is embargo. It's an optional ban or trade or other activity with a particular country. Next is loans, credits, currency manipulation. It's a simple explanation. It's borrow money to another country. Foreign aid. It's the money of the country are voluntarily transferred to the another country. Okay. Next is military aid. Military aid is used to assist a country or its the people in its defense. Okay. The next is the objective of foreign policy. Objective of foreign policy. Foreign policy sets short-term, middle-term, and long-term goals and objectives to be achieved in proportion to a state's capabilities. Such classification of foreign policy objectives is based on that of the three criteria. 1. The value placed on the objective. 2. The time elements placed on its achievement. 3. The kind of demands the objective imposes on the other state in international system.
So, moving on to another instrument of foreign policy, which is economic. It is used to achieve the foreign policy of objective of a state, and its objective is to provide the basic needs like coal, transport, electricity supply, water supply, and etc. And a state has a capacity to reward or punish, and it's by manipulating economic policies, and those economic policies are administered by the government. And this economic policy should include the government spending, taxation, and distribution of goods and supply of money. So, according to Baldwin, and in his classical economic statecraft, he claims that in international relations, a statecraft could be understood as a governmental influence attempts directed at other actors, both state and non-state. In international system, in other words, it pertains or refers to the selection of means for the pursuit of foreign policy goals. And his approach, there is not much difference between instruments of economic foreign policy and economic statecraft. And as we follow Baldwin's approach, we could define instruments of economic statecraft as all the economic means by which foreign policymakers might try to influence other international actors. In this definition, the focus is put on the implementation of a state's foreign policy. So consequently, the international dimension of economic statecraft could also be called economic instruments of foreign policy. So some of the examples of economic instruments are tariffs, quotas, boycotts, embargoes, and aid, in which my co-member will explain later on, but before that, let us know the importance of economic instruments in promoting a country's development. And Holistic states that in the PowerPoint is the trade instruments of foreign policy are normally used for three purposes, and that is to achieve any foreign policy objective, and it is by exploiting need and dependence in offering economic rewards or threat, in ending or imposing economic punishments. B is to increase a state's capability, and C is to create economic satellites, or to help to maintain the political obedience in satellites by creating a relationship of economic dependence. So trade instruments are used to achieve an emerging country's development, and there are actions that needs to work together in able to fulfill that goals, and includes economic, financial, and commercial negotiations, trade promotion, resource exploration rights, and etc. So moving on to the next slide, when rewards are offered or economic punishment are threatened, there are at least two conditions that must be fulfilled to make the exercise of influence effective. A is the target of influence or act must perceive that there is a genuine need for the reward or for the avoidance of the punishment. B is to no alternative market or source of supply must be easily available to the target. So it basically means that they must be aware of the fact that there is a bona fide need in reward and avoidance of punishment, and the supply must be easily available to the act or target of influence.
Good day, my name is Alani Angkanan and I will be presenting the core values and interest or the short-term objective of foreign policy, including the middle range and the long-range objective of foreign policy. So first, let's start with the core values and interest or the short-range objective. From the name itself, core values and interest, it is the main, the fundamental, and the integral values and interest meaning to say, before moving forward to other objectives, the state shall first attain, to fulfill, to succeed in their core values and interests, because I have said, in the integral and the most important. Core values and interests can be described as those kinds of goals for which most people are willing to make ultimate sacrifices. So what do you think are those? Think of it thoroughly. It is indeed really important because people are willing to make sacrifices, not just a simple sacrifice, but ultimate sacrifices. It is also defined by other article stating it should be attained at all cost. So what are those? It is the self-preservation of political and economic systems, the people and its culture, and the territorial integrity of the state. To cut the long story short, it is sovereignty. Territorial integrity and political independence enjoys the foremost priority of each and every nation state. Why? So let's go back to our previous lesson. What are the elements of the state? The state has 4 elements. First is the population, territory, government, and lastly is the sovereignty. And also, as discussed in our previous lesson, losing even a single element of a state make him no longer a state but a nation. These are short-range objectives because other goals cannot be realized if the existence of the state and its political units are not ensured. For example, other countries such as US and Israel still pursues the policy called extraterritoriality. There, when the national interests and claims of a country is projected beyond the limits of its geographical boundary. Israel, although did not publicly state that it had a major objective of expanding its territories at the expense of Arab states, its military actions, wars with Arab countries, has demonstrated intentions. Another example is the China and the Philippines. China is currently putting up establishments in a portion of West Philippine Sea, which is outside their geographical territory. And that is extraterritoriality. The state has to girdle itself to realize these objectives directly, quickly, forcefully, and effectively. It has no luxury of time in case of fulfilling these core objectives. To cut again the long story, it is indeed to be fulfilled before anything else as soon as possible. Priority siya kasi mahalaga siya. Bigyan mo siya ng oras. Parang ganon. So, kidding aside, so now we can clearly understand the core objectives and interest and why it is just considered as the short-term objective. Sana nga naintindihan nyo? How I wish. So let's move on. Sana kayo din. So let's move on with the middle range objective. We can describe this objective in a single word, which is interdependence. So what is interdependence? To satisfy domestic needs and aspirations, states should have to interact to others. Trade foreign aids, access to communication facilities, sources of supply, and foreign market are for most states necessary. What you have none or lack of shall be seek from other states for a certain reason. What is that certain reason? It is social welfare. So every country shall acknowledge the need of its people, such as basic necessities, goods, work, security, and many more. And if the state's effort and resources do not meet the expectations and demands of the people, here comes the need of help. From where? From countries or states, from other countries or states. It is usually the keen desire of each state to establish and strengthen and widen economic ties with other states. Hence, these ties also causes course of action that have the highest impact on the domestic economic and welfare needs and expectations of the people, which leads the states to economic betterment. Let us take note of two important things about this middle range objective of foreign policy. First, The middle range objective drastically varies across states. The variation is obviously due to difference in the level of economic and technological progress and many more. For example, Philippines and United States have different needs from other countries. We can say that our need or we need more from others than them because they have a better economic, technological advancement, and military, and so on and so forth. Second is social welfare and economic development cannot be achieved through self-help, as most states have only limited resources, administrative services, and technical skills. So here, if you want to achieve a better economic stand or to make economic progress, huwag mataas ang pride. You can improve by just your limited sources because as time passes by, people and the world demands more and more. Wala naman sigurong tindang milk tea sa hardware o kaya naman pako sa milk tea shop. So each country has different resources or services that other states lack of. So that's why that's come in the interdependence. What are the three main functions of the government? A government basic functions are providing leadership, maintaining order, providing public services, providing national security, providing economic security, and providing economic assistance. Clearly stated, as I have mentioned, the mid-range objective of providing public services, economic security, and economic assistance is the government's job. Because the primary commitment of the government must be to pursue those course of action that have the highest impact on domestic and welfare needs of its people. In the process, the state has to diversify its trade and economy in order to make it resilient enough to come up to the challenges of the competitive world. So that's for the mid-range objective. I hope you understand it better, even just a portion of what I have discussed. So last objective of the foreign policy, let's move forward, is the long-range objective. So what is the long-range objective? Long-range goals are those plans, dreams, and visions concerning the ultimate political or ideological organization of international system and rules governing relations in that system. The difference between middle range and long-range goals relates not only to different time elements inherent in them. There is also significant difference in scope. In pressing for middle-range goals, states make particular demands against particular interests. In pursuing long-range goals, states normally make universal demands for their purpose is no less than to reconstruct an entire international system according to a universally applicable plan or vision. From the name itself, it is a very long process of fulfilling the said vision, dreams, and plans. Long-range objectives are not only time-consuming, but also indefinite and vague. Why indefinite? Because it is not just like saying, I will end drugs in 6 months, and voila, drug ends. Long-range objective concerns is really vague and complicated. As stated in the module, in pursuing long-range goals, states normally make universal demands. Universal, we are talking about the whole world. For this purpose is no less than to reconstruct an entire international system according to a universally applicable plan or vision. Can it be made possible by just single snap of a finger? Or after a year or two? Basically, no. It takes a lot to make this long-term objective be accomplished. For example, Russian communist leader Lenin and Stalin reiterated that they would endeavor to expand communist ideology through every nook and corner of the globe. As to them, the capitalist system was defective and exploitative in its very nature. It was the long-range objective of communist Russia, because by doing so, they did not set any time limit for the realization of these objectives. Very broad, right? to expand communist ideology through the every nook and corner of the globe. See, the scope is too large. Long-range objective is a very complicated and long process. There is also no assurance if it could happen or be done. Okay, let's have a short recap before I end this discussion. So core values and interest, or the short-range objective, is the territorial integrity and political independence is the foremost priority of each and every nation state. So that's the most important part of the core values and interest. Before anything else, before for fulfilling other objectives of the state, they should first have the territorial integrity and political independence. So to make it short, they should possess sovereignty. What next is the middle range objective. Course of actions that have the highest impact on the domestic economic and welfare needs and expectations of people, which leads the state to economic betterment. So the keyword here in the middle range objective of foreign policy is the economic betterment. So here, the government provides social welfare to its people. And lastly is the long-range objective. These are the plans and dreams and visions concerning the ultimate political or ideological organizations of the international system. Their purpose is no less than to reconstruct an entire international system according to a universally applicable plan or vision. The scope is vague and it has no inherent time limit.
Patterns and trends, foreign policy behavior. Refers to the action states take toward each other. It is important to note that these actions usually are not as end in themselves, but are tied in some way with larger purposes, from long-range objective to short-term objective, that leaders hope to achieve in their dealings with other countries. It says that the foreign policy behavior is their connection to each other to achieve their goal with the help of other countries. The nature of foreign policy is such as that one can expect to find double standards and inconsistencies in the records of all countries. Double standards and inconsistencies are type of foreign policy because all countries have it and experience it. Foreign policy, double standards and inconsistencies means not same or unfair. Example is the gender inequality. Men getting paid more for the same work than women is a double standard. In this situation, women experience double standards, which is unfair treatment. Arnold Wolfers, a famous specialist in the field of international relations, suggested that all foreign policy behavior ultimately boils down to three possible patterns. One is self-preservation or maintaining the status quo. Status quo are the content to preserve and maintain the essential characteristics of the existing international order and the general distribution of the power. It means status quo seek to maintain the above level of the country. Example is the United States. As one of the strongest country in the world, United States is the idealistic model for a self-preservation since it bases its foreign policy of liberal ideas. It means United States maintaining their present order and make sure its place at the top of the international system. The second is self-extension or revising the status quo in one's own favor. And the third is self-abnegation, revising the status quo in someone else's favor. The self-extension and self-abnegation are the revisionists that are seek to change things in international politics because they are dissatisfied with the international status quo. Example is the Russia. Russia is a powerful and influential in its own right. It is not as powerful or influential as the United States. For the reason, Russia constantly tries to become more powerful in an effort to change the status quo. Next is foreign policy dimension. The analysis of foreign policy
Behavior can also be done along a number of specific dimensions, keeping in mind that behavior can change over time and with a different style of leadership and the circumstances. This dimension includes alignment, scope, and modus operandi.
Dimension. After the analysis of foreign policy behavior explained by Ms. Irene Apolinario, there is also specific dimension including alignment, scope, and modus operandi. Keep in mind and remember that it changes over time and it's different kind of leadership or in different kind of circumstances. So, further ado, let's explain the first specific dimension, which is the alignment. The national leaders in a certain country choose to have an ally or to remain neutral. When we say alignment, according to the Oxford language, it is a position of agreement or simple as word as support. We can identify alignment tendencies such as alliance, neutrality, or non-alignment. What do we mean when we say alliance? Alliance is a formal agreement to provide a mutual military assistance. It carries legal weight, yes, benefits, as well as risk. The best example of this is the Philippines. Philippines has a good connection, a good alliance with the US. And one of the best scenario of this is during the Marawi. US back up the Philippine military during that kind of war. So that it's proven tested that it's really good to have an alliance, though it is some kind of risk with the United States. Another alignment tendencies is neutrality. When we say neutrality is a stance of non-partisanship. One of the example of this is an individual state like Switzerland. Switzerland is known as notoriously neutral country during World War II, and today it has a sizable military to deter aggression, holding an armed neutrality. Switzerland choose to have a neutral alignment kind of tendency because they have a sizable military to protect their state. So let's go now to the second specific dimension, and that is the scope. The scope is a country activities or interests. Example of this is China. China has a far international contact, and because of that great influence, they are good in gaining in goods and services, while the other country who is limited in activities in abroad receive dispute and crisis. In scope, some actors act in global terms, means internationally. Some are in regional terms, association of the law in the region. And some are in isolationism, which means interference. The last specific dimension is the modus operandi. Some countries rely on multilateral institutions to address different states. Some are unilateral means. It means that they are trying to solve their problems themselves. One of the mode operation or the modus operandi is diplomacy, where different or several states participate rather than have a bilateral connection between two countries. What do we mean when we say multilateral forum? It is enhancing or would enhance collective barraging power of these countries in relation to developed countries. So therefore we conclude that knowing, studying foreign policy and, and diplomacy has a huge impact, not because of its function, not because of its history, but its role in our society and individual states. That's all for today. Thank you and God bless us all.
So that's all for the group report. We all hope that you have learned something from our discussion, and we wish to thank you for taking part and listening to us and lending us some time in imparting our information regarding foreign policy and democracy. Questions, clarifications, and bilateral actions will be entertained right after this report. Once again, thank you, and we wish you all safe from your homes. God bless everyone. Good day.